When the robbery went wrong, the criminals thought they had the perfect human shield, a harmless old locksmith. They never imagined that this quiet man had survived more explosions than anyone in the city, and he was about to prove it. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you believe stories of quiet heroism deserve to be told, please subscribe to One Human, One Story. Harold Brennan had owned Brennan's Lock and Key for 37 years, tucked between Murphy's Delicatessen and Chen's Flower Shop on Maple Street in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Every morning at exactly 7:15, he unlocked the narrow glass door of his shop, flipped the handwritten "Open" sign, and settled behind his worn wooden counter with a cup of black coffee and the Cedar Falls Gazette. To his neighbors, Harold was unremarkable. A slight man in his late 60s with calloused hands, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of patient demeanor that came from decades of listening to people's lock-related troubles. He spoke in measured tones, never rushed a job, and kept meticulous records in a leather-bound ledger that dated back to when he first opened the shop in 1988. What nobody in Cedar Falls knew was that before Harold Brennan became the town's most trusted locksmith, he had been Staff Sergeant Harold Brennan, Explosive Ordnance Disposal, United States Army. For 23 years, from 1965 to 1988, Harold had defused bombs, cleared minefields, and dismantled improvised explosive devices in places most people couldn't find on a map. Vietnam, Lebanon, Grenada, Panama, wherever American forces encountered unexploded ordnance, Harold was there, steady-handed and clear-minded, separating life from death one wire at a time. He had earned 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and the respect of every demolitions expert in the Army. But all of that felt like another lifetime now. Buried as deep as the shrapnel fragments that still occasionally set off metal detectors at the airport. Harold had chosen locksmithing precisely because it was the opposite of his military service. Constructive rather than destructive, protecting rather than eliminating, bringing peace of mind instead of managing chaos. For 37 years, it had been enough. Tuesday morning, November 15th, started like any other. Harold arrived at 7:10, 5 minutes earlier than his usual routine, because he had noticed Mrs. Patterson's front door lock sticking again and wanted to finish cutting her a new key before the morning rush. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of burning leaves and the promise of the season's first snow. Harold unlocked his shop, turned on the lights, and fired up the key-cutting machine in the back room. By 7:30, he had Mrs. Patterson's key ready and was settling in with his coffee when he noticed the black sedan parked across the street. It wasn't unusual for people to park on Maple Street. The municipal lot was often full, but something about this particular car caught Harold's attention. The windows were tinted darker than Iowa law allowed. The license plate was obscured by a strategically placed smear of mud, and the engine was still running, even though no one had gotten out. Harold's trained eye cataloged these details automatically, the same way he had once scanned roadsides for the telltale signs of buried explosives. After 23 years in EOD, certain instincts never went dormant. At 8:45, Harold was helping Mrs. Eleanor Vance, the retired librarian, with a stubborn padlock when 3 men burst through his front door. The first man was tall and wiry, wearing a black ski mask and brandishing a chrome-plated revolver. The second was shorter but broader, with a blue bandana covering his face and a sawed-off shotgun in his hands. The third man, who seemed to be the leader, wore a gray hoodie pulled up over a baseball cap, his features obscured by wraparound sunglasses and a surgical mask. In his right hand, he carried a canvas duffel bag. In his left, a semi-automatic pistol. "Everyone on the ground, now!" the leader shouted, his voice muffled but clearly agitated. "This is a robbery!" Mrs. Vance gasped and stumbled backward, knocking over a display of keychains. Harold stepped protectively in front of her, his hands raised, his mind already shifting into the calm, analytical mode that had kept him alive through 2 decades of handling live explosives. "Please don't hurt her," Harold said quietly. "She's 78 years old. Let her go, and I'll cooperate with whatever you need." The leader studied Harold for a moment, taking in his slight frame, his wire-rimmed glasses, his neatly pressed flannel shirt. "Smart old man. What's your name?" "Harold. Harold Brennan. This is my shop." "Well, Harold, today's your lucky day. We need your expertise." The man gestured toward the back of the shop with his pistol. "We hear you're the best locksmith in town. Time to prove it." Harold's stomach clenched as he began to understand. "I don't keep much cash here. Maybe $300 in the register." The leader laughed harshly. "We're not here for your $300, Harold. We're here because the Cedar Falls First National Bank has a vault that needs opening, and their usual key seems to be unavailable. The bank." Harold had worked on their locks before, routine maintenance, upgrading security systems. But what these men were describing wasn't routine maintenance. They were planning to rob the bank, and they needed a locksmith to help them crack the vault. Harold's mind raced. The First National Bank served the entire Cedar Falls community: teachers' pension funds, local businesses' operating accounts, college savings for hundreds of families. More importantly, Tuesday was Social Security Day. The bank would be full of elderly residents cashing their monthly checks, people like Mrs. Vance who depended on that money to survive. "I can't help you rob a bank," Harold said simply. The leader's mood shifted instantly. He stepped closer, pressing the barrel of his pistol against Harold's chest. "You can, and you will. Because if you don't, we're going to start with Grandma here." He gestured toward Mrs. Vance, who was trembling behind the counter. "Then we'll work our way through every shop on this block until we find someone who will help us. How many people have to get hurt because you want to be a hero, Harold?" Harold looked at Mrs. Vance's frightened face, then at the 3 armed men who had invaded his peaceful shop. In Afghanistan, he had once defused a truck bomb parked outside a school, knowing that one wrong move would kill not just him, but 60 children inside. In Lebanon, he had crawled through a minefield to reach wounded Marines, accepting that each step might be his last. But this was different. This wasn't a war zone. This was Cedar Falls, Iowa, where the biggest crime in recent memory had been teenagers vandalizing the water tower. These people didn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire of someone else's desperation. "All right," Harold said finally. "I'll help you. But you have to promise me that nobody gets hurt." The leader smiled coldly. "Smart man. Let's go." They left Mrs. Vance tied up in the back room with the tall man standing guard, while Harold was forced into the black sedan with the leader and the man with the shotgun. As they drove the 6 blocks to the bank, Harold studied his captors, assessing their capabilities the same way he had once evaluated explosive devices. The leader was clearly military trained. His grip on the pistol was professional, his commands were precise, and he had positioned himself in the back seat where he could monitor both Harold and the driver. The driver, however, seemed nervous, constantly checking his mirrors and fidgeting with the radio. "Amateur," Harold concluded. "Probably recruited for this specific job." The big man with the shotgun was harder to read, but Harold noticed his hand shaking slightly as he lit a cigarette. Fear or drugs, possibly both. That made him unpredictable, and unpredictable people were dangerous. "What's the plan once we're inside?" Harold asked, partly to gather information and partly to keep them talking. Nervous criminals made mistakes, and mistakes created opportunities. "Simple," the leader replied. "We walk in, announce ourselves, get everyone on the ground. You open the vault, we load up, and we're gone in under 10 minutes. Clean and professional." And after that? After that, you get to go home to your little lock shop and pretend this never happened. Everyone wins. Harold doubted it would be that simple. Bank robberies were federal crimes, bringing the full weight of the FBI down on anyone involved. These men were either desperate enough to ignore the consequences or stupid enough not to understand them. Neither scenario boded well for the innocent people who would inevitably get caught in the middle. The Cedar Falls First National Bank occupied a stately brick building that had been the heart of the community's financial life since 1923. Its lobby featured marble floors, brass fixtures, and the kind of solid, dependable architecture that was supposed to inspire confidence in depositors. On a typical Tuesday morning, it would be busy but not crowded. Tellers processing routine transactions, loan officers meeting with farmers planning spring purchases, elderly residents conducting their weekly banking rituals. Harold had been inside hundreds of times over the years, not just for banking, but to service the locks on the safety deposit boxes, the vault door, and various security systems throughout the building. He knew the layout by heart, including details that wouldn't be obvious to casual observers. The main vault used a time-delayed dual combination system that required both the bank manager's key and the head teller's authorization code. There was also an older vault in the basement, originally built in the 1920s, and now used primarily for document storage. Most importantly, Harold knew that every Tuesday morning at exactly 9:30, an armored car arrived to transport the weekend's cash deposits to the Federal Reserve Bank in Des Moines. If these men were planning their robbery for 9 o'clock, they would be walking into a bank that contained not just the usual daily cash reserves, but also 3 days' worth of accumulated deposits. The take would be substantial enough to attract serious federal attention. As they pulled into the bank's parking lot, Harold noticed several things that his captors had apparently missed. A Cedar Falls Police Department cruiser was parked at the nearby coffee shop, meaning Officer Martinez was probably inside getting his usual breakfast burrito. The bank's security camera system had been upgraded 6 months ago and now included motion-activated recording that fed directly to the police station. Most significantly, Harold could see the armored car approaching from the south, exactly on schedule. "You might want to reconsider this," Harold said quietly. "There are complications you haven't accounted for." The leader followed Harold's gaze to the approaching armored car, and his expression darkened. "Change of plans. We wait until they're gone, then move fast. Everyone stay calm." But calm was exactly what they didn't stay. The driver began muttering under his breath, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. The big man with the shotgun kept checking the parking lot, his agitation increasing with each passing minute. Only the leader maintained his composure, but Harold could see the calculation in his eyes as he reassessed their situation. The armored car pickup took longer than usual. Harold watched as the guards performed their routine, checking paperwork, verifying amounts, loading sealed bags of cash and coins. The process typically took 10 to 12 minutes, but today there seemed to be some discrepancy in the paperwork that required additional verification. 15 minutes passed, then 20. "Screw this," the driver finally said. "We're calling it off. Too many variables. We're not calling anything off," the leader snapped. "We've come this far. Harold here is going to do exactly what we need him to do, and we're walking out of there rich men." "And if something goes wrong?" the big man asked. "If something goes wrong, Harold takes the blame. He's the one opening the vault. He's the one with the expertise. We're just customers who got caught in the middle of his crime." Harold felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized the full scope of their plan. They weren't just robbing the bank. They were setting him up to take the fall. In their version of events, Harold Brennan, respected locksmith and pillar of the Cedar Falls community, would be the mastermind behind the heist. His knowledge of the bank's security systems, His access to specialized tools, his reputation for discretion, all of it would point to him as the inside man who had planned and executed the robbery. The three armed men would disappear, leaving Harold to face federal charges for bank robbery, conspiracy, and whatever other crimes the prosecutor could make stick. It was actually a clever plan, Harold had to admit. Except for one crucial flaw, they had no idea who they were really dealing with. The armored car finally departed at 10:15, and the leader immediately ordered them to move. "Remember," he told Harold as they approached the bank's entrance, "you're doing this willingly. You're the expert they hired to crack the vault. Play your part, and everyone goes home safe. Screw with us, and people start dying." Harold nodded, but his mind was already working through possibilities. In EOD training, they had drilled endlessly on a simple principle. When faced with an explosive device, you had three options: evacuate the area, call for backup, or disarm it yourself. Sometimes evacuation wasn't possible. Sometimes backup wasn't available. Sometimes you were the only thing standing between a live bomb and innocent civilians, and you had to act. This felt exactly like that. The bank's lobby was moderately busy when they entered. Harold counted quickly. 3 tellers behind the counter, 4 customers in line, an elderly couple at the new accounts desk, and manager Janet Morrison visible through her office window. 8 innocent people, not counting the security guard who is currently checking his phone instead of watching the door. When the leader shouted, "Everyone on the ground! This is a robbery!" Harold was struck by how quickly normalcy could shatter. One moment, people were conducting their routine banking business, chatting about the weather, complaining about interest rates. The next, they were face down on cold marble, terrified and confused. Tuesday morning transformed into a potential tragedy. Harold found himself thinking about improvised explosive devices, how they could sit harmless for hours, days, even years, until some tiny trigger activated them and changed everything in an instant. These 3 men were like IEDs themselves, he realized. Unstable, unpredictable, and capable of devastating everything within their blast radius. "Harold, you're up," the leader called. "Open the vault, now." Harold approached the main vault, his hands steady despite the circumstances. The combination lock was a Mosler double guard from 1987, updated with modern time delay mechanisms, but fundamentally unchanged from the system he had serviced dozens of times. As he began to work, his mind automatically shifted into the same methodical approach he had used for bomb disposal. Assess the situation, identify the components, determine the safest sequence of actions. The combination was 47 to 2361, the bank manager's birth date. Harold had learned it 3 years ago when he had been called in to service a jammed mechanism, and his trained memory had retained it ever since. But as he reached for the dial, Harold made a calculation that would change everything. Instead of opening the vault, he began turning the dial in a deliberately incorrect sequence. To anyone watching, it would look like he was attempting to crack the combination. In reality, he was activating the vault's silent alarm system. 3 incorrect attempts in rapid succession would trigger a direct signal to the Cedar Falls Police Department and the FBI field office in Cedar Rapids. It would also lock down the vault's time delay mechanism for exactly 45 minutes. Enough time for law enforcement to respond, but not long enough to make the robbers desperate enough to start shooting hostages. "It's not working," Harold announced after the 3rd failed attempt. "The system's more sophisticated than I expected. I need more time." The leader's face darkened. "How much more time?" "Maybe an hour. The vault has multiple fail-safes. If I trigger the wrong one, it could lock down permanently." Harold was lying, of course, but his tone carried the authority of genuine expertise. After 37 years of explaining lock mechanisms to frustrated customers, he could make any technical explanation sound plausible. What Harold was really doing was buying time while simultaneously positioning himself to act. During his years in EOD, he had learned that the most dangerous moment in any bomb disposal wasn't when you first approach the device. It was when you realized that standard procedures weren't going to work, and you had to improvise. This was that moment. The leader began pacing, his composure finally cracking. The driver was stationed by the front door, but Harold could see him checking his watch every few seconds. The big man with the shotgun was guarding the hostages, but his attention kept drifting to the windows, clearly worried about police response. All three men were showing classic signs of mission stress, the kind of deteriorating situational awareness that led to catastrophic mistakes. That's when Harold noticed something that made his blood run cold. The big man's finger was resting inside the trigger guard of his shotgun, and every time a car passed outside, his hand tensed. The weapon was pointed in the general direction of the hostages, including Mrs. Henderson from the church auxiliary and young Tommy Chen, who couldn't be more than 19 years old. One startled reaction, one loud noise, one moment of panic, and someone innocent was going to die. Harold had defused hundreds of explosive devices over the course of his military career, but he had never forgotten his first. A roadside bomb outside Da Nang in 1967. His commanding officer had told him something that day that became his personal creed. "Sergeant, every bomb you face has already made its decision about whether it's going to explode. Your job isn't to change its mind. It's to be smarter than the person who built it." Looking at these three increasingly agitated men, Harold realized that this situation had the same fundamental dynamic. They had already committed to violence the moment they walked into his shop with loaded weapons. His job wasn't to convince them to abandon their plan. It was to be smarter than them. And Harold Brennan had been outsmarting dangerous situations for a very long time. "I need to check something in the vault mechanism," Harold announced, opening his small toolkit. "There might be a manual override I can access." What he actually pulled from his kit wasn't a lockpick or a screwdriver. It was a small electronic device that looked like an old-fashioned pager, but was actually a portable emergency beacon, a gift from his former EOD unit when he retired. Harold had never had occasion to use it, but he had maintained it faithfully for 37 years, replacing the battery annually and testing the signal quarterly. The device was designed to broadcast a priority emergency code directly to military and federal law enforcement agencies, identifying Harold as a former EOD specialist requesting immediate tactical support. As he pretended to examine the vault mechanism, Harold activated the beacon and slipped it behind a decorative panel where it wouldn't be discovered. Within minutes, every law enforcement agency within 50 miles would know that Staff Sergeant Harold Brennan, retired EOD, was signaling an active crisis situation at the Cedar Falls First National Bank. But Harold knew that even with help coming, the next 30 minutes would be the most dangerous. The robbers were trapped in an increasingly impossible situation, and desperate people did unpredictable things. Worse, they still believed Harold was their willing accomplice, which meant they trusted him enough to let him move around the bank relatively freely. That trust was about to become their downfall. "Progress?" the leader asked, his voice tight with barely controlled anxiety. "Getting there," Harold replied calmly, "but I'm going to need access to the electrical panel to bypass one of the security circuits. It's in the basement." The leader considered this, clearly torn between suspicion and desperation. Finally, he nodded. "Take him down," he told the big man. "Watch him every second." Harold descended into the bank's basement, with his captor following close behind. The basement housed not just the electrical systems, but also the original 1923 vault, the furnace room and storage areas filled with old records and equipment. More importantly, it contained something Harold had noticed during previous service calls, but had never had reason to mention to anyone: a tunnel The Cedar Falls First National Bank had been built during Prohibition, when the bank's president had allegedly maintained business relationships with certain entrepreneurial individuals whose activities required discretion. The tunnel connected the bank's basement to the storm drain system that ran beneath Maple Street, emerging in the alley behind Murphy's Delicatessen. Harold had discovered it by accident while tracing electrical lines and had kept the knowledge to himself, understanding instinctively that some secrets were better left undisturbed. Today, that tunnel represented more than just a historical curiosity. It was a tactical advantage. "The electrical panels over here," Harold told his guard, leading him toward the far corner of the basement. As the big man followed, Harold noticed that the shotgun's safety was off, and the man's finger was still resting on the trigger. Amateur hour, Harold thought. In the Army, that kind of weapons handling would have earned a month of kitchen duty. As they reached the electrical panel, Harold made his move. 37 years of civilian life hadn't erased the muscle memory of 2 decades in EOD. The techniques he had learned for quickly and quietly neutralizing sentries were still there, buried under decades of peaceful routine, but ready when needed. Harold's attack was swift, precise, and designed to incapacitate rather than kill. A pressure point strike to the big man's wrist caused his hand to spasm, dropping the shotgun. A follow-up blow to the solar plexus doubled him over, and a final strike to the carotid artery rendered him unconscious. The entire sequence took less than 5 seconds and made almost no noise. Harold caught the falling man and laid him gently on the floor, then quickly secured the shotgun and checked for additional weapons. He found a knife, a cell phone, and a wallet containing an ID for someone named Marcus Webb from Davenport. Harold pocketed the cell phone and the ammunition, then used electrical tape from his toolkit to secure Webb's hands and feet. The man would wake up in 30 minutes with a headache and some bruised ribs, but no permanent damage. Now Harold had to get back upstairs and deal with the 2 remaining robbers before they realized their partner was missing. But first, he had a phone call to make. Using Webb's cell phone, Harold dialed 911. "Cedar Falls Emergency Dispatch," came the professional voice. "This is Harold Brennan at First National Bank," Harold said quietly. "We have an active hostage situation. 2 armed suspects in the main lobby, approximately 8 civilians at risk. I've neutralized 1 suspect in the basement. Do not approach the building until you have tactical units in position. The remaining suspects are armed and agitated." "Sir, are you law enforcement?" "Former military EOD. I've activated emergency protocol Charlie 77. Check your federal alert system." Harold ended the call and turned off the phone. Protocol Charlie 7. 7 was the code his unit had used to indicate that an EOD specialist was actively engaged in neutralizing a threat and required tactical support, but no immediate intervention. It was a signal that told responding agencies, "Response, any moment now." The man was going to realize that something was fundamentally wrong with this situation. "Time's up," the leader announced suddenly. "Open the vault now or I start shooting hostages." Harold turned to face him, his expression calm, despite the escalating threat. "It's open," he said simply. The leader's eyes lit up with greed and relief. "About time. Get it open all the way." Harold grasped the vault's handle and pulled. The massive door swung open with a satisfying click, revealing the bank's cash reserves stacked neatly on metal shelves. The leader moved closer, drawn by the sight of more money than he had probably ever seen in one place. It was exactly what Harold had been waiting for. As the leader stepped into the vault's threshold, Harold slammed his shoulder into the man's back, sending him stumbling into the vault. In the same motion, Harold grabbed the vault door and slammed it shut, trapping the leader inside. The vault's time lock mechanism would prevent it from being opened from either side for exactly 43 more minutes. Plenty of time for law enforcement to arrive and sort out the situation. Now Harold shouted to the driver. The young man, startled by the sudden action, but committed to his decision, lunged at empty air. The leader was locked in the vault. Marcus was unconscious in the basement, and there was no one left to tackle. Harold almost felt sorry for him. "It's over," Harold told the confused driver. "Put your weapon down and get on the ground. Nobody has to get hurt." The driver looked around the lobby, taking in the shocked faces of the hostages, the empty space where his partners had been, and the calm, authoritative presence of the man he had thought was just a harmless locksmith. Slowly, he set his pistol on the floor and raised his hands. "I don't understand," he said. "What just happened?" Harold smiled gently. "You just learned that appearances can be deceiving. I'm not the locksmith you thought I was. Through the bank's front windows, Harold could see the first police cars arriving, their red and blue lights flashing in the morning sun. Soon there would be federal agents, detectives, reporters, and all the chaos that came with a thwarted bank robbery. Harold would have to explain who he was, how he had ended the situation, and why a retired locksmith had the skills to single-handedly neutralize 3 armed criminals. But for now, there was a more immediate concern: the 8 innocent people who had been caught in the middle of someone else's crime. Harold moved among the hostages, checking for injuries and offering reassurance. Mrs. Henderson was still shaking, but unharmed. Tommy Chen had a small cut on his forehead from when he had hit the floor, but nothing serious. Manager Morrison was already on the phone with bank headquarters, explaining that the situation was under control. "Is it really over?" asked Mr. Patterson, the elderly farmer who had been waiting to deposit his harvest check. "It's really over," Harold confirmed. "Everyone's safe." As FBI agents began entering the building, Harold reflected on the strange turns life could take. This morning, he had been Harold Brennan, unremarkable locksmith. By lunchtime, his carefully guarded secret would be front-page news across Iowa and beyond. There would be interviews, commendations, probably a key to the city from the grateful mayor. More importantly, there would be questions about his past that he had spent 37 years avoiding. But as Harold watched the hostages being reunited with their families, as he saw the relief and gratitude in their eyes, he realized that some secrets were worth revealing. For decades, he had defined himself by the quiet civilian life he had built in Cedar Falls. Today, he discovered that he was still the same man who had volunteered to crawl through minefields to save wounded Marines, who had defused truck bombs to protect school children, who had chosen to serve others even when it meant risking everything. The locksmith and the soldier weren't separate identities. They were both expressions of the same fundamental character. Both were about protecting people, solving problems, and standing between chaos and order when it mattered most. If you've ever met someone who seemed ordinary on the surface but turned out to be extraordinary when it counted, share their story in the comments below. Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones we pass every day without noticing, until the moment they remind us what true courage looks like. And if you believe these stories deserve to be told, subscribe to One Human, One Story for more tales of hidden heroism and quiet bravery that change the world one life at a time.